Get your daughter under control, Ortiz.
Charles Remington's voice sliced through the hum of the park, loud enough for every parent on the benches to hear. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete as he gestured at Elena, cornered by a ring of older kids who wore the same smug smirk as their father. This playground isn't for Janitor's children. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed fixed on his daughter. Elena's small frame pressed against the rusting slide, her knuckles white as she clutched her sketchbook. One boy, Charles's eldest, flicked the pages with a cruel finger, scattering her drawings across the ground. Laughter rang out. "You should be grateful we even let you mop our building," Charles added, his voice sharp, calculated. Daniel's response was quiet, almost too calm. "Funny thing about floors, Charles. They always reveal who leaves the real mess behind." The laughter wavered. The parents watching from the benches looked up, sensing a ripple they couldn't yet explain. And if you're hearing this now, you should probably subscribe, because what's about to happen in this park will flip every expectation you've been fed about power, wealth, and who truly commands respect. You don't want to miss the moment silence falls. Daniel stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his work boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. There was a steadiness in the way he moved, like a man who had lived through worse storms than this. His uniform was faded, but the way he carried himself made it seem almost like a badge. He bent down, gathering Elena's sketches one by one. Each drawing was careful, precise. Dreamscapes of trees, rivers, and bridges she longed to walk with him. She was her mother's daughter, gentle and bright, and protecting her was all that mattered. Daniel tucked the pages back into her arms, brushing her trembling fingers with a reassuring squeeze. The hush that settled was heavier than Charles expected. Daniel's silence wasn't submission. It was something else, something sharper. His hands were steady. Too steady for a man beneath him. Too steady for someone just a janitor. Elena whispered, "Dad, let's just go." But her eyes told a different story, pleading not for escape, but for him to stand tall. The moment carried weight Daniel had felt before, in hospital corridors where seconds decided lives, in nights when his daughter cried herself to sleep after her mother's passing, in every shift where he swallowed insults to keep food on the table. He could endure anything thrown at him. But today his daughter's dignity was on the line. The bench of parents leaned in, curious, sensing the tension shift. Daniel's quiet defiance unsettled them more than any raised voice could. He straightened, looking Charles dead in the eye. "You've mistaken silence for weakness." Elena slipped her hand into his, finding safety in his grip. Daniel turned, guiding her, away from the circle of taunts, away from the scattered laughter, but his words lingered in the air like a storm building on the horizon. "So tell me, where are you watching from? Because this isn't just another father-daughter moment in a park. This is the beginning of a reckoning. And Charles Remington? He just picked the wrong man to humiliate." Daniel's last words hung in the air, still echoing, as he led Elena toward the park's edge. The other parents tried to shake it off with forced laughter, but there was something in his tone, measured, deliberate, that left a quiet unease behind. Charles Remington smirked, masking the flicker of irritation in his eyes. For a man used to total dominance, Daniel's calm refusal to bow felt like an insult that demanded repayment. Elena clutched Daniel's hand tightly. Her sketchbook was pressed against her chest, the edges bent from where it had been tossed aside. Daniel didn't speak as they walked, but she could feel the energy radiating from him, not anger exactly, but a stillness that carried weight. She remembered it from nights when she had nightmares. He never shouted, never panicked. He just held her close until the fear dissolved. That same stillness now made Charles uneasy. At the picnic tables, Charles made sure his voice carried again. "That's right, Ortiz. Walk away. That's what men like you do. Clean up, move along, and hope the real players don't step on you." He poured himself another coffee from his stainless steel thermos, its engraved initials catching the sun like a crown. Daniel paused just long enough to glance over his shoulder. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he crouched to Elena's level, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Keep your head high," he whispered. "They don't decide who you are." His words weren't for Charles, they were for her. But Charles heard them anyway, and the faint smile that touched Daniel's lips stung more than any insult could. The other parents shifted uncomfortably. Some admired Charles's wealth, his power, his position. But watching him pick apart a child and her father in public didn't sit right. Whispers began, quiet but undeniable, as eyes flicked between the polished CEO and the janitor who carried himself like he belonged anywhere. Charles leaned back in his chair, his gold cufflinks gleaming. "This is why people like you never rise above mediocrity, Ortiz. You accept scraps, you accept dirt. Don't think a few dramatic words change that." Daniel didn't answer. He simply stood, guiding Elena toward the far bench near the fountain. His silence forced others to fill the space with their own thoughts. Even the children who had taunted Elena began to look uneasy, their bravado faltering without their father's voice propping it up. Elena opened her sketchbook again, flipping past the smudged pages. She set her pencil down carefully, as if nothing had happened. Daniel watched her shoulders straighten, and he felt both pride and sorrow. She shouldn't have to practice resilience at 9 years old. Charles, however, wasn't finished. He approached slowly, his expensive shoes clicking on the pavement. Parents looked on, some pretending to check their phones, others openly curious. He loomed over Daniel, who sat quietly beside his daughter. "You think you can teach her pride, Ortiz?" Charles's voice dropped, meant only for Daniel, but loud enough to carry. "What future does she have? A scholarship? A big life in a house you'll never afford? She'll end up just like you, wiping down tables unless she learns to marry up. That's reality." Daniel's gaze lifted, steady, unflinching. He studied Charles for a long moment, then answered softly, "Reality changes faster than you think." It wasn't bluster. It wasn't even defiance. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the conviction of someone who had seen fortunes vanish, lives upended, and power crumble in the span of a heartbeat. Charles's smirk faltered, though he quickly masked it with a sneer. A boy's sudden cry broke the tension. One of the children, Charles's youngest, had tripped while running near the fountain. At first it seemed like nothing more than a scraped knee, but the cries turned panicked, shrill. The child clutched his chest, gasping for air. The laughter and chatter around the park collapsed into silence as parents rushed forward. Charles's voice, once dripping with confidence, cracked. "Call an ambulance!" he barked, waving his phone in the air. His hands shook as he fumbled with the screen, the polished calm gone, replaced by raw fear. Daniel was already moving. Elena called after him, but he pressed her hand gently and whispered, "Stay." He crossed the grass in steady strides, his expression sharpening, the quiet mask lifting just enough to reveal something different: control, precision, certainty. The crowd parted instinctively, as if sensing a shift in command. Charles's panic only amplified the contrast. The CEO, who once strutted with power, now helpless. The janitor, once dismissed, now stepping into the center like he had always belonged there. Daniel knelt beside the boy, assessing quickly, hands steady, eyes sharp. "Clear the space," he said, his voice low but commanding. No one questioned him. Parents pulled back, stunned by the authority in his tone. Charles knelt opposite him, frantic. "He can't breathe. Do something." Daniel met his eyes, and for the first time that day, Charles saw something he couldn't dismiss: expertise, calm under fire, a man who had faced life and death before and come through it. Daniel's silence earlier wasn't weakness, it was restraint. The victory strategy was already in motion. This wasn't about pride or status anymore, it was about survival. And the one man Charles had ridiculed was now the only one standing between his son and disaster. The parents, the children, even Elena from the bench, they all saw it. The balance of power had shifted, though no one yet knew just how much. Daniel's voice carried over the hushed park. "He's panicking. I need space. Now." Parents obeyed instantly, stumbling back from the fountain. The circle widened, leaving Daniel and the boy in its center. The child's face was pale, his breaths shallow, fingers clutching at his chest as tears streamed down his cheeks. Charles hovered, frozen between terror and disbelief, his expensive suit looking suddenly out of place against his son's gasps for air. Daniel's hands moved quickly but with precision. He tilted the boy forward, checked his airway, and listened to the uneven breaths. His motions weren't guesses. They were practiced, disciplined. To the crowd, it looked like instinct. To Daniel, it was muscle memory. "Call emergency services," he said firmly, glancing at one of the mothers clutching her phone. "Give them the child's age, symptoms, and location. Keep the line open." The woman nodded, fumbling with her screen, but grateful for the directive. Charles's voice cracked. "What's happening to him? Tell me." Daniel didn't look up. "He's having an acute asthma attack. Do you have his inhaler?" Charles blinked, confused. "His what? No, he's never had..." His voice trailed off as realization set in. He didn't know, he hadn't noticed. Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced at another parent. "Check his backpack now." The man darted toward the scattered belongings, rifling through until he found a small inhaler buried in the side pocket. He rushed it back, placing it in Daniel's open palm. Daniel positioned the inhaler, steadying the boy with one hand. "Easy," he murmured, calm but firm. "Breathe with me. In, hold, out." His own breath was measured, guiding the child through each motion, slowly, painfully. The boy's chest began to rise more evenly. The frantic gasps softened into shaky, deliberate breaths. The crowd exhaled as one, relief washing through them. Parents whispered, astonished. Their eyes weren't on Charles anymore. They were fixed on the janitor who had taken control when wealth and power collapsed into helplessness. Charles sagged back onto his heels, sweat beading his forehead. He looked at Daniel like a man seeing a stranger for the first time. How did you know what to do?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He focused on the boy until his breathing steadied, then passed the inhaler into the child's trembling hand. Only when he was certain the danger had passed did he lift his eyes. "Because I've seen it before," he said quietly. The simple statement carried weight. To those listening, it was enough to spark questions, to plant doubt in the narrative Charles had built about Daniel being nothing more than the help. Elena stood from the bench, eyes wide but shining. She had always known her father was different, but watching him now, commanding a crowd, saving a child, made her chest swell with pride. The paramedics were still minutes away, but the worst had passed. The boy clung to the inhaler, his breaths shallow but stable. Daniel gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're going to be all right." Charles swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached for his son. "Thank you," he muttered, the words tasting unfamiliar on his tongue. Daniel rose to his feet, wiping his palms against his faded work pants. His uniform bore stains of the day's labor, yet at that moment he looked like the most capable man in the park. His silence now wasn't retreat. It was authority earned. Around them, the whispers grew louder. How did he know that? He moved like a doctor. Didn't Charles call him a janitor? The tide was turning. Daniel finally turned to Charles. His gaze wasn't cruel, but it was steady, unshakable. Your son needs follow-up care. Make sure he sees a physician as soon as possible. And listen when he tells you what he feels. You won't always get a second chance. Charles nodded stiffly, his usual confidence stripped away. For the first time, he didn't have a cutting remark. He had no leverage here, no wealth that could rewrite what every witness had just seen. Victory strategy progress was clear. The crisis had exposed the fragility of power. Wealth had failed. Status had failed. Only Daniel's hidden expertise had mattered. And though his full past remained unspoken, the aura around him had shifted. He was no longer invisible. Elena slipped her hand into his as he stepped back from the fountain. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling between awe and gratitude. Daniel gave her a small smile, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "It's all right. He's safe now." But inside, he felt the weight of the crowd's eyes. The questions were just beginning. He knew this moment wasn't the end. It was the spark. His silence, his steady hands, his unexpected authority, none of it would stay hidden for long. And Charles? The man who had mocked him minutes earlier now faced a new humiliation. His power had collapsed in front of witnesses, and the janitor he scorned had become the hero his son would remember. The park, once filled with laughter and arrogance, now hummed with whispers of respect and curiosity. The sirens wailed in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder as the ambulance sped toward the park. Parents stepped aside, creating a clear path from the entrance to the fountain, but their eyes never left Daniel. He hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't made a show of anything, yet everyone in the park knew who had taken control, when it mattered most. Elena stood close to him, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his hand. She didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes told him enough. Pride, relief, and something else. For the first time in too long, she wasn't ashamed when others looked at them. She wanted the world to see him. Charles sat by his son, pale and shaken, the arrogance drained from his face. His cufflinks caught the afternoon sun, but they no longer gleamed like symbols of power. They looked like ornaments from another world, useless in the one that had just unfolded. His son's shallow breaths were steadier now, thanks to Daniel. The ambulance finally screeched to a halt. 2 paramedics rushed out, wheeling a stretcher across the grass. The crowd stepped back further, murmuring, some parents still shaking their heads as they replayed the scene in their minds. Daniel crouched beside the boy one more time. "They'll take good care of you," he said gently. Then he stepped back, allowing the professionals to move in. But the paramedics didn't brush past him as they might any bystander. One of them gave him a look of recognition, a brief pause, as if silently asking, "You know what you're doing, don't you?" Daniel only nodded once. They worked quickly, checking vitals, preparing to transport the boy. Charles followed, frantic, peppering them with questions. But his voice didn't carry authority anymore. It carried desperation. The paramedics answered politely, though it was Daniel's earlier intervention that had saved the critical window. Everyone knew it. When the stretcher rolled toward the ambulance, Charles finally turned back to Daniel. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes flickered between humiliation and gratitude, caught between 2 truths. The man he had mocked had just preserved what mattered most, and everyone had seen it. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Sirens rose again, and then the vehicle disappeared down the street. The park fell quiet, unnervingly so. Parents and children looked at Daniel as if expecting more, as if he owed them an explanation. Daniel adjusted the strap of his faded backpack and turned toward Elena. "Let's go home," he said simply. His voice carried no pride, no desire for recognition. Just a father choosing his daughter above everything else. But as they walked, whispers swelled behind them. "Did you see the way he handled it? Not like a janitor, like a doctor. He knew exactly what to do." Reputation was leaking, drop by drop, carried not by Daniel, but by the voices of those who had witnessed what Charles never expected anyone to see. Elena tugged his sleeve as they reached the sidewalk. "Dad, they're talking about you." Daniel gave her hand a squeeze. "Let them. Talking doesn't change who we are." But Elena shook her head, eyes bright. "No, it does. They saw what I see." Her words struck deeper than she knew. Daniel glanced at her, reminded of the reason he kept his past buried. Not for shame, but to protect her, to keep life steady after loss. Yet here she was, telling him his silence might no longer be protection at all. Behind them, Charles remained at the park with the other parents, his son already en route to the hospital. His grip on the social stage had cracked. He had always ruled through fear, money, and arrogance, but none of those could erase what had just happened. His world was built on control, and for the first time, Daniel had stripped it from him without raising his voice. The victory strategy pressed forward. Wealth had failed in the face of crisis. The next step would be inevitable. Questions, exposure, and the slow unraveling of the divide Charles thought permanent. As Daniel and Elena reached the corner, a man jogged after them. It was one of the fathers from the benches, still holding his phone. "Hey, wait!" he called. Daniel turned, wary. The man caught his breath, then said, "I just wanted to thank you. If it weren't for you—" He broke off, shaking his head. "Listen, people are going to want to know. You should, well, just know they saw everything." Daniel inclined his head. "I didn't do it for them." "I know," the man replied. "That's why it matters." With that, he left, jogging back toward the murmuring group. Daniel and Elena continued home, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. For Daniel, the crisis was over. But the shift it had created was only beginning. His hidden past was no longer safe in silence. The community had caught a glimpse, and whispers had already begun to carry his story further than he wanted. For Charles Remington, humiliation had taken root in public. His authority had fractured in the eyes of those who once admired him. And the worst part? He owed the janitor his son's life. Neither man said it aloud, but both knew this confrontation wasn't finished. The walk home was quiet, but not the kind of quiet Daniel wanted. Elena clutched his hand, her sketchbook tucked tightly under her arm, her eyes darting at every person they passed. She had noticed it too, the stares. People who didn't know them slowed their steps, whispering. Parents from the park drove by slowly, their glances following like shadows that refused to lift. Daniel kept his shoulders straight, but inside he felt the shift pressing against him. He had always lived carefully, choosing invisibility where possible. It kept Elena safe, kept their lives stable. But what had happened at the park wasn't something that could be folded away into silence, not when half the community had witnessed it. By the time they reached their modest apartment, Elena finally broke the silence. "Dad, why did you know what to do? Why didn't anyone else?" Daniel hesitated at the door, his hand on the key. The truth was complicated. heavy with memories he'd never wanted to place on her young shoulders. He looked down at her hopeful eyes and chose his words carefully. Because sometimes life teaches you things you don't forget, even if you want to. Her brows furrowed, but she nodded. She had learned long ago when not to press further. Still, the unspoken questions lingered in her gaze as they stepped inside. That night, after Elena had drifted into sleep, Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the worn wood beneath his hands. His phone buzzed twice with messages from a number he didn't recognize. "Saw what you did today. People are talking." He set it face down. The attention wasn't what he wanted, but whispers had a way of traveling faster than silence. The next morning, when Daniel arrived at the corporate building where he worked, things were different. The security guard who usually gave him a dismissive nod straightened up and said, "Morning, Ortiz." His tone carried a respect that hadn't been there before. In the lobby, two receptionists whispered as he passed with his mop bucket, their eyes following him until he disappeared down the hall. Daniel said nothing, but he noticed everything. As he pushed his cart toward the elevators, the doors opened, and Charles Remington stepped out. His suit was darker today, sharp lines pressed into perfection, but his eyes carried fatigue. The faint smudges beneath them betrayed a night spent in a hospital. His son was alive. That much was clear. But the weight on Charles's face was unmistakable. The lobby quieted. Employees waiting with coffees glanced between the two men. For years, Charles had embodied power here, and Daniel had been background noise. Today, their presence side by side felt like a fracture in that balance. Charles's gaze locked on Daniel. For a brief second, gratitude flickered. But it was quickly buried beneath something else. Resentment. He stepped forward, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep others from hearing. "You think yesterday changes anything? Don't fool yourself. You're still pushing that bucket, Ortiz. Don't start imagining otherwise." Daniel met his stare, calm and steady. He didn't rise to the bait, didn't offer the crowd a spectacle. Instead, he said simply, "Your son's alive. That's all that matters." Charles's jaw tightened. He brushed past, but his words hadn't landed the way he wanted. Employees shifted uneasily, the power dynamic not quite the same anymore. By mid-afternoon, the whispers had spread through the building. A receptionist stopped him in the corridor. "I heard what you did in the park. Saved a kid, right?" Another added, "Charles's son? Really?" Their voices carried awe and disbelief. Daniel kept his responses brief. "I was there. He needed help." Then he returned to his work, the mop gliding over marble tiles that reflected the corporate world above him. But the silence of humility wasn't enough to dam the current. By evening, even the building's maintenance staff were exchanging looks. One older custodian leaned in and whispered, "You know, they're saying you moved like you'd been trained, like military or medical. Which is it?" Daniel didn't answer. He only moved on, but his silence was its own kind of confirmation. That night, Elena overheard two parents outside their apartment building talking. Remington's boy would have been gone if not for him. Funny, isn't it? The janitor did what the CEO couldn't. She carried the words inside and asked at dinner, "Dad, why are people acting like you're someone else?" Daniel's fork paused over his plate. He gave her a tired smile. Because people only see what they want to see. Yesterday they saw more than usual. Elena tilted her head. "But you didn't change. They did." Her observation pierced him more deeply than she knew. She was right. And though he wanted to shield her, he also knew there was no going back. The whisper of his hidden life had already escaped. Victory strategy progress was taking shape. Yesterday's crisis had exposed a gap wealth couldn't close. Today, whispers began knitting themselves into reputation, leaking pieces of truth into places Daniel hadn't meant them to go. And Charles? He had returned to his office only to find the story had beaten him there. His employees eyed him differently, respect fractured by the knowledge that his power had collapsed in public. Every retelling of the park scene chipped away at his image. The janitor had become a name they spoke with quiet reverence. By the next morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. Daniel barely stepped into the lobby with his cleaning cart before he noticed the stairs. Conversations hushed when he passed, only to resume in quick whispers after he turned the corner. He kept his head down, pushing the mop bucket toward the elevators. But the change was undeniable. Yesterday, he had been invisible. Today, he was a subject of fascination. Charles Remington's absence was equally noticeable. The CEO's sleek black Mercedes usually occupied the front space, a symbol of his dominance. But today it wasn't there. Some said he was still at the hospital with his son. Others hinted he was avoiding the building because of what had happened. Either way, his absence left a vacuum in the air, one Daniel never asked for but couldn't escape. He worked his shift with precision, wiping marble floors until they gleamed. Yet his mind wasn't on the tiles. He replayed Elena's words from dinner the night before. "You didn't change. They did." It was true, and that truth carried weight. Every mop stroke felt like a reminder that silence was no longer enough to shield them. Around mid-morning, the elevator doors opened, and a small crowd stepped out from the executive floor. They were sharply dressed, their lanyards bearing the company's crest. Among them was Marissa Kent, Charles's executive assistant, a woman known for her efficiency and loyalty to her boss. She paused when she saw Daniel. "Ortiz," she said, her tone clipped but not dismissive. "Mr. Remington will be back this afternoon. He'll want to see you." Heads turned at her words. A janitor summoned to the CEO's office was unheard of. Daniel gave no reaction beyond a calm nod. "Understood." By noon, whispers in the cafeteria were louder than the clatter of trays. Employees speculated about why Charles wanted to see him. Some thought it would be a quiet thank you. Others guessed it would be an attempt to reassert dominance. But no one doubted that something had shifted. When his shift ended, Daniel returned home to find Elena waiting by the window. "How was it?" she asked, rushing to him. He set down his bag and crouched to her level. "Different," he admitted. "Your friend's father, Charles. He wants to see me." Her eyes widened. "At his office?" Daniel nodded. He didn't add that he expected nothing good from it. He had dealt with men like Charles before, men who turned gratitude into leverage, who sought to control every narrative. This meeting wouldn't be about thanks. It would be about power. That night, Daniel prepared in silence, not with suits or speeches, but by centering himself. He cleaned Elena's sketches from the table, straightened her pencils, and helped her with her homework. Routine grounded him. He didn't need armor. He only needed the reminder of why he endured everything. The next afternoon, he climbed the stairs to the executive floor. The contrast was jarring. Polished wood, abstract art on the walls, the air faint with expensive cologne. His boots squeaked against the shine of floors he had once mopped. Now, every step felt like a trespass. Marissa met him at the door to Charles's office. "He'll see you now." Inside, Charles stood by the massive window overlooking the city. His son's photograph sat on the desk, framed in silver. Daniel noticed it immediately. Charles turned, his face tight. "You made quite an impression, Ortiz." Daniel didn't answer. He stood steady, hands at his sides, letting silence carry more weight than words. Charles continued, pacing slowly. "The story's everywhere. Employees won't stop talking. Parents at the park won't stop calling. Even my board has heard." His voice hardened. "You embarrassed me, in front of everyone." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I saved your son." The words landed like a hammer. Simple, undeniable. Charles flinched just slightly before regaining composure. Yes, and for that, I should thank you, but don't mistake what happened for anything more. You're still the janitor. I won't have rumors disrupting my company. Daniel's calm remained intact. He knew Charles's type, a man who couldn't stomach being indebted to someone beneath him. Gratitude would never outweigh pride. You can't control what people saw, Daniel said evenly. They'll decide what it means. For the first time, Charles lost his rhythm. His jaw clenched. You think they'll respect you? They'll forget in a week. But even as he said it, they both knew it wasn't true. The whispers had already escaped his control. The meeting ended without ceremony. Charles dismissed him with a wave, but the tension hung heavy. As Daniel stepped into the hallway, employees pretended to busy themselves, yet their glances lingered. The reputation leak had spread further. He was no longer just Daniel Ortiz, the janitor. He was the man who had exposed the fragility of power. Back home, Elena waited with eager eyes. Did he thank you? Daniel exhaled, setting aside his bag. Not in the way you think. But people know now, she said. They'll see you. He looked at her, a quiet ache in his chest. Maybe that's what worries him most. Victory strategy progress was clear. The crisis had revealed wealth's limits, and now the cracks were widening. Charles had tried to reassert control, but his words had no weight against what everyone had witnessed. The janitor who saved a life couldn't be unseen. Daniel lay awake that night staring at the cracked ceiling of their small apartment. Elena slept soundly in the next room, her sketchbook on the nightstand, pencil still resting on the page she hadn't finished. He should have been at peace. Her laughter had returned that evening, and her shoulders no longer sagged under the weight of humiliation. But Daniel knew storms didn't pass so easily. They shifted, and Charles Remington was the kind of man who didn't let storms die without striking back. Morning came gray and heavy. Daniel brewed coffee in the chipped pot, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen. He ate quickly, kissed Elena's forehead, and walked to work with his mop handle over one shoulder, like a soldier carrying a rifle. The streets felt different now. Every nod from a passerby, every look from a stranger, acknowledgement was a weight he hadn't asked for. When he reached the corporate building, the shift was undeniable. Workers in crisp suits parted slightly in the lobby, whispering as he wheeled in his cart. The security guard gave him more than a nod this time. "Glad you were there, Ortiz?" he said, almost sheepishly. Daniel acknowledged it with a polite dip of his head, but nothing more. He wasn't here for recognition. He was here to work, to keep the routine steady for Elena. But the building wasn't letting him fade into routine anymore. On the 12th floor, he found 2 employees lingering near the elevator. Their voices hushed when they saw him, but not quickly enough. He saved Remington's kid. I swear he moved like a surgeon. A janitor? A surgeon? That doesn't make sense. Daniel's jaw flexed, but he kept his eyes down. Reputation leak. He had felt it building since the park. Now it was alive in the building's veins, carried by whispers he couldn't stop. By midday, the rumors had grown legs. While he scrubbed the conference room's glass doors, 2 interns passed by, one whispering, "They say he used to be some kind of trauma doctor." The other replied, "If that's true, what's he doing here?" Daniel's rag froze against the glass. The past he had buried was being pulled into daylight. He finished his task quietly and moved on, but the unease gnawed at him. Late in the afternoon, the inevitable happened. Marissa Kent approached him, a manila folder pressed to her chest. Her voice was professional, but her eyes carried curiosity. "Mr. Ortiz, the board has requested your presence tomorrow. They want to hear directly from you about what happened at the park." Daniel stilled. "The board? She nodded once. Mr. Remington didn't make the request. It came from others. That detail mattered. Charles was losing control of the narrative, and the board wanted clarity. His son's crisis had become more than a personal matter. It was a corporate story now, a reflection on leadership, on competence, on image. Daniel returned home in silence that evening. Elena ran to him, excited. "Did they say anything about you today?" He set his bag down, crouching to her level. "More than usual." She tilted her head. "And tomorrow?" He sighed, brushing a hand over her hair. "Tomorrow they want me to talk." Her eyes widened. "In front of everyone?" Daniel nodded. "In front of people who think their money makes them untouchable." Elena gripped his sleeve, worry clouding her pride. "Will they be mean again?" Daniel gave her a small smile. "They might. But we don't run from truth, remember?" She nodded slowly, echoing his words from the park. "They don't decide who we are." The next morning, Daniel dressed in his usual uniform, faded work shirt, sturdy boots. He wouldn't play their game by changing who he was. At the building, the air felt electric. Employees gathered in small knots, buzzing about the unusual event. A janitor summoned by the board. When Marissa escorted him into the high-rise conference room, the contrast was stark. Mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, leather chairs occupied by executives in tailored suits. At the head of the table sat Charles, his face pale but composed, his cufflinks gleaming like armor. The board members turned as Daniel entered, their gazes sharp, evaluative. Some were curious, others skeptical. A few carried the quiet awe of those who had heard the story and believed it. Charles broke the silence. "Mr. Ortiz, thank you for joining us. We've asked you here to clarify certain accounts." His voice was measured, but tension laced every syllable. This wasn't gratitude. It was containment. Daniel stood at the far end of the table, hands steady at his sides. He scanned the faces, then spoke evenly. "There's not much to clarify. A child couldn't breathe. I knew what to do, that's all." But the board wasn't satisfied. One leaned forward. "Where did you learn that?" "Employees say you moved like a trained professional." Whispers rippled around the table. Charles stiffened. Daniel's silence carried weight. He could feel the edge of revelation pressing closer. He hadn't meant to step into this stage, but the victory strategy was advancing exactly as fate demanded. Wealth and titles had failed, and now the truth of competence was prying open the walls Charles had built. He let the silence stretch before answering, his voice quiet but clear. "Let's just say I've been in situations where panic wasn't an option." The board leaned in. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The boardroom seemed to hold its breath after Daniel's words. Chairs creaked as executives shifted, their polished pens stilled above expensive notepads. Charles's jaw tightened. His empire was built on absolute control, and Daniel's calm refusal to explain had unsettled the balance. One of the directors, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, broke the silence. "Mr. Ortiz, with respect, people don't move like you did without training. You stabilized a child's airway, administered an inhaler with precision, and gave instructions paramedics later confirmed were correct." "That isn't coincidence." Murmurs rose around the table. Daniel stood steady at the far end, his faded uniform stark against the gleaming wood. He didn't answer right away. Letting the quiet expand was deliberate. He had learned long ago that silence, when used correctly, carried more weight than words. Charles finally snapped. "Enough, he's a janitor. That's all anyone needs to know." His voice was sharp, desperate to cut the tension. "This circus ends here." But the board didn't look convinced. Their eyes lingered on Daniel, not Charles. Authority had shifted, and Charles's dismissal sounded more like defense than command. Daniel finally spoke, voice measured. "I didn't come here to argue about titles. Your questions aren't about me. They're about what you witnessed, wealth and power, failing in a moment when only steady hands mattered." The words landed heavy. Executives exchanged uneasy glances, as if the foundation they stood on had tilted. The gray-haired director leaned back, studying him. "Interesting, you know what I think, Mr. Ortiz? The company could use more of that steadiness." Charles bristled. "You can't be serious." She raised a hand. "I'm not suggesting anything beyond what's plain. Competence deserves recognition." Daniel didn't let the conversation spiral further. He inclined his head slightly. "Recognition isn't what I want. I only ask you remember what really counts when control slips away." The boardroom quieted again. Even those who hadn't witnessed the park firsthand felt the weight of his words. Marissa, standing by the wall, caught Daniel's eye. She had always been loyal to Charles, but her expression now carried something different. Respect. Perhaps even doubt in the man she had served without question. The meeting ended abruptly, Charles cutting it short with a thin smile and a promise to resume business as usual. The directors filed out whispering, their gazes trailing Daniel longer than they trailed their CEO. As Daniel stepped back into the elevator, Marissa followed. "You know you just embarrassed him in front of the board," she said quietly. Daniel didn't flinch. "He embarrassed himself." She studied him for a moment, then added, "They'll keep asking questions. People don't forget what they saw." He gave a small nod, then descended to the lobby. That evening, walking home with Elena, he felt her tug at his arm. "Dad, are they still talking about you?" He looked down at her, the city lights catching in her eyes. "Yes." Her lips curved in a faint smile. "Good. They should." Daniel chuckled softly. She was braver than he had been at her age, unwilling to hide from truth. It gave him both pride and ache. She deserved innocence, not battles against arrogance. At their apartment, Daniel helped her set up her pencils and paper. "Draw something peaceful tonight," he suggested. She nodded, sketching quickly, her strokes bold with new confidence. Meanwhile, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "They're calling you a hero. Don't let Charles bury this." Daniel set the phone aside. Hero was never what he wanted. He only wanted to protect Elena. Still, he knew the current was moving too fast to control. The next morning, whispers became more pointed. In the break room, two executives debated openly. If Ortiz hadn't been there, Remington's son, well, you know. And Charles? He froze. Imagine if the press gets hold of that. Daniel, mopping near the doorway, heard every word. He kept his face neutral, but inside he recognized the shift. The cracks in Charles's armor were spreading, not because Daniel pushed, but because others saw what wealth had failed to cover. By midday, Marissa approached him again. "The directors want to invite you to Friday's company luncheon. They think it would be appropriate." Daniel frowned. "Appropriate?" Her lips quirked slightly. "To acknowledge you. Publicly." Charles wouldn't allow it, Daniel knew. But the request itself revealed how far the tide had turned. That night at home, Elena bounced on her heels. "A luncheon? Dad, that's good, isn't it?" Daniel crouched, steadying her excitement with his calm. "It's attention. Attention can be dangerous. But you saved him," she insisted. "Why should you hide?" Her question cut to the heart of what Daniel had wrestled with since the park. He had chosen humility as a shield, but Elena was right. Silence had a cost, too. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "We don't need their approval. What matters is you're safe, and you know who I am." She looked at him with fierce certainty. "I do. But maybe they need to know too. Her words stayed with him long after she slept. In her innocence, she had named the truth. Vindication wasn't only personal, it was public. And tomorrow, whether he liked it or not, the public stage was waiting. So if you're still with me, don't forget to subscribe. Because what comes next? That's when silence truly falls. The invitation came the next morning, formal and embossed, slipped into Daniel's locker by someone who didn't want to be seen. You are requested to attend the quarterly corporate luncheon Friday at noon, Main Hall. Daniel read it twice, then folded it neatly into his pocket. He knew this wasn't a gesture of kindness, it was politics. The board wanted to display him, a living reminder of the CEO's failure, whether Charles approved or not. And Charles? He would see it as a direct threat. That afternoon, as Daniel polished the marble floors in the lobby, Charles arrived. His Mercedes gleamed outside, and he walked through the glass doors in a storm gray suit that matched his expression. For a moment, the building seemed to stiffen around him. He looked at Daniel, and though he forced a smile for the employees nearby, his eyes were hard. "Enjoying the attention?" Charles said under his breath as he passed. Daniel didn't rise to it. He wrung out his mop, answering calmly, "Attention fades. Actions don't." The subtle barb landed, and Charles's smile cracked before he strode toward the elevators. Employees noticed. Whispers followed. By evening, Elena had already heard about the luncheon through the grapevine of schoolyard chatter. "Dad, they're going to recognize you," she said, her eyes bright as they sat at the dinner table. "Doesn't that mean they'll finally see who you really are?" Daniel looked at her across the table, her small hand smudged with pencil dust from drawing. He wanted to tell her yes, that recognition meant respect, safety, and stability, but he knew better. Recognition was a blade with two edges. "What they see doesn't change what I am," he said gently, "but it will change what happens next." Friday arrived swiftly. The main hall buzzed with conversation as executives, managers, and employees gathered at round tables draped in white linen. Chandeliers cast warm light across polished silverware and crystal glasses. It was a stage built for power, a place Daniel had only ever seen from the periphery when cleaning after hours. Now he was summoned to it. He entered quietly, his uniform pressed but unchanged. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by an uneasy silence. Suits and dresses turned toward him, eyes wide with curiosity, some with admiration, others with disbelief. A janitor in their midst was an anomaly, and an unspoken challenge. The chairman of the board stood to address the room. "Before we begin today's proceedings, we must acknowledge an act of courage and competence that occurred in our very community. An employee, Mr. Daniel Ortiz, took decisive action in saving a life when others faltered." Applause rose, scattered at first, then building. Daniel stood still, his hands at his sides, the sound washing over him. He didn't bow, didn't gesture. He let it pass, his face unreadable. Across the room, Charles sat rigid, his smile stretched thin, his fingers tapping sharply against the tablecloth. Each clap struck him like a hammer, driving cracks deeper into the facade he had built for years. When the applause faded, the chairman turned to Daniel. "Would you like to say a few words?" Daniel's gaze swept the room. Faces stared back, some expectant, others skeptical, all waiting. He spoke calmly, voice carrying just enough to be heard. "I'm not here for praise. A child needed help. I did what I could. That's all." But then he paused, letting silence anchor his words. "What matters is not the titles we wear, or the wealth we display. What matters is what we do when the moment comes, and whether we can meet it." The hall fell utterly silent. Forks stilled, conversations died. For a fleeting second, Daniel's simple words eclipsed the grandeur around him. Charles rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough!" His voice thundered across the hall. "This man is no hero. He's a janitor who overstepped his place. Don't be fooled." The outburst backfired. Gasps echoed, heads turned. The CEO's mask had slipped, revealing not authority but desperation. Daniel didn't flinch. He looked directly at Charles, his voice calm. "Your son is alive, not because of who you are, but because in that moment, none of this," he gestured at the chandeliers, the tables, the finery, "mattered." The words hung heavy, undeniable. Employees exchanged glances, murmurs rising like a tide. Some nodded subtly, others whispered openly. Charles had always been the symbol of control, but now the contrast was undeniable. When life demanded action, it was the janitor who stood steady while the CEO faltered. Daniel stepped back, allowing the moment to settle. He had said enough. Vindication wasn't about shouting louder. It was about letting truth speak for itself. Elena's words from days earlier echoed in his mind. They should see you. Now they had. And the shift was irreversible. Victory strategy progress was clear. The crisis had revealed competence. Whispers had spread it. And now the public exposure had crystallized it. The balance of power had tilted. And Charles couldn't drag it back. The luncheon resumed awkwardly, but nothing felt the same. Daniel remained at the edge of the room, silent but unshaken, while Charles sat seething, trapped in the spotlight of his own unraveling authority. The luncheon ended with forced smiles and uneasy handshakes. Executives filed out of the main hall in murmuring clusters, but their conversations were no longer about quarterly earnings or market forecasts. They revolved around a single image: Daniel Ortiz, standing steady while their CEO lost control. The story had already cemented itself in the company's bloodstream. Daniel slipped away before the last table. Had been cleared. He wanted no more of the spotlight. Yet as he walked through the lobby with his mop bucket in tow, employees stopped mid-step, their gazes lingering with quiet recognition. Some nodded. One whispered, "Thank you." Daniel kept moving. That evening, he and Elena ate quietly at the small kitchen table. She looked at him with wide eyes. "They clapped for you, didn't they?" Daniel exhaled. "For a moment." Her smile was small but fierce. "It's more than a moment. They'll remember." He hoped she was right, but he also knew Charles Remington, and men like him did not forgive humiliation, especially not in public. The next day proved it. When Daniel arrived at the building, the atmosphere was charged. The security guard avoided eye contact. The receptionists, who had once whispered admiration, were silent. Whispers still buzzed, but this time there was tension in the air, like a storm ready to break. By mid-morning, Marissa Kent appeared at the janitorial office. Her face was pale, her clipboard clutched too tightly. "Daniel," she said softly, "the board wants another meeting, today, in the atrium." The atrium was the building's centerpiece, glass walls rising 30 stories, sunlight pouring onto polished stone, a space designed to showcase grandeur. It wasn't just a meeting place, it was a stage, and today it would become a courtroom. When Daniel entered, employees were already gathering on the balconies above, leaning over railings for a view. Word had spread fast. Executives lined one side of the floor, the board members another. At the center stood Charles Remington, immaculate in a dark suit, every detail sharpened like a weapon. He turned as Daniel approached, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Mr. Ortiz, I'm glad you came. After all, you've become quite the topic of conversation. But today, let's put these rumors to rest." The crowd hushed. Charles spread his arms. his expression polished into something resembling magnanimity. "This man," he said, gesturing to Daniel, "helped my son in a moment of need. For that, I will always be grateful. But let's be clear, he is not what some of you are whispering. He is not a doctor, not a leader. He is a janitor. Nothing more." Gasps rippled through the spectators. Charles's words were meant to reassert dominance, but the edge of desperation was plain. Daniel stood steady, hands at his sides. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Charles pressed on. Competence in one lucky moment does not erase years of mediocrity. This company thrives on excellence, not sentiment, and excellence is not mopping floors or fixing chairs. The words were cruel, sharp, meant to cut. Some in the crowd looked down uncomfortably, others glanced at Daniel with sympathy. The stage had been set for him to bow his head, to retreat into silence. Instead, Daniel spoke. His voice was calm, deliberate, every syllable carrying. "You're right about one thing, Charles. I am a janitor. I clean what others leave behind. I fix what others break. I notice what others overlook. And when your son's life was slipping away, none of your titles, none of your wealth, none of this glass and stone could help him. But I could." The atrium went utterly silent. Daniel continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Excellence isn't about what you wear or the office you sit in. It's about what you do when it matters. And in that moment, your power failed. Mine didn't." The words hit like thunder. Employees above erupted in murmurs, some clapping before they realized it. Executives shifted uneasily, caught between loyalty to their CEO and the undeniable truth hanging in the air. Charles's face flushed, his mask cracking. "You dare lecture me in my own building?" Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth doesn't care where it's spoken. The crowd stirred louder now, voices rising. For the first time in years, Charles wasn't the center of gravity. Daniel was. Victory strategy progress sharpened here. The crisis had forced recognition. Whispers had spread reputation. The luncheon had offered exposure. But now, in the atrium, Daniel's vindication became undeniable. Wealth and power had been stripped bare before witnesses. The janitor's hidden strength was no longer rumor. It was reality, etched into the memory of everyone present. Elena's words echoed in Daniel's mind again. They should see you. Now they did. And Charles? His empire was no longer unquestioned. He had tried to reassert dominance, but in the act, he revealed just how fragile it was. The atrium buzzed as Daniel turned to leave, Elena's sketchbook tucked under his arm, a quiet reminder of what truly mattered. Justice hadn't finished its work, but silence had already fallen. The atrium still pulsed with noise as Daniel walked toward the exit, Elena's sketchbook tucked beneath his arm like a shield. Employees leaned over the glass balconies, whispering, pointing, their voices mixing into a restless tide. For years, Charles Remington had stood untouchable in this building. Now the janitor he mocked had stripped away his aura in front of the entire company. But Charles wasn't finished. His shoes struck the polished floor like gunshots as he strode after Daniel. "Don't walk away from me," he barked, his voice echoing off the stone. The crowd hushed again, the tension thick enough to cut. Daniel stopped but didn't turn. He could feel Elena's drawings pressed to his side, grounding him in what mattered. Slowly, he pivoted, facing the man who had humiliated his daughter and now tried to reclaim control. Charles spread his arms, raising his voice for everyone to hear. "This is what happens when order collapses. A man who scrubs toilets thinks he can challenge the people who built this city. Is this what you want? Chaos? Janitors parading as heroes? The words were sharp, but they carried less power than Charles thought. The audience had seen too much. They remembered his panic when his son gasped for air, his helpless hands shaking while Daniel remained steady. His insults now sounded more like excuses than truth. Daniel's voice carried, calm and unhurried. Chaos isn't when a janitor saves a life. Chaos is when the people with power pretend their titles make them untouchable. A murmur spread across the balconies. Someone clapped once. Others joined, hesitant at first, then stronger. The sound rolled upward until the atrium rang with applause. Charles's face blanched. "Stop this," he snapped, turning toward the crowd. "You work for me. Don't forget who signs your checks." But the applause only grew louder. Employees weren't clapping for defiance. They were clapping for truth, for dignity, for the man who had stood steady when the one with all the money and power had crumbled. Daniel didn't bask in it. He simply stood there, shoulders square, letting the noise speak for itself. Vindication wasn't about words. It was about presence. The truth had unfolded in real time, and no amount of shouting could erase it. The board members stood on the ground floor, their faces a mix of shock and calculation. The gray-haired director, who had questioned Daniel earlier, leaned toward another member, her expression unreadable. Decisions were already forming in their minds. Charles's voice broke through again, desperate now. "You think this changes anything? Tomorrow you'll all forget. Tomorrow, Ortiz will be back to pushing his mop, and I'll still be the one running this company." Daniel finally stepped forward, his boots echoing on the stone. He stopped only a few feet from Charles, close enough that the crowd could see the contrast between them. The pressed suit and cufflinks against the faded uniform, the clenched jaw against the calm gaze. "Maybe you're right," Daniel said evenly. "Tomorrow I'll be back to mopping floors. But when people here close their eyes, they won't remember the suit. They'll remember the hands that shook when a boy couldn't breathe, and they'll remember the ones that didn't." Gasps rippled through the atrium. The words landed like a verdict, final and unshakable. Charles faltered, his lips parting, but nothing came out. For the first time, silence engulfed him. Not the silence of power, but the silence of a man who had been stripped bare in front of his empire. The applause surged again, louder than before. It wasn't a cheer for rebellion. It was a recognition of truth, the kind that couldn't be polished into spin or buried under wealth. Daniel turned, not waiting for Charles's reply. He walked toward the exit, the sketchbook still tucked against his chest. Each step felt heavy but certain, carrying the weight of years of quiet dignity now laid bare for all to see. At the glass doors, he paused. He looked back only once, his gaze sweeping the atrium. The crowd, the balconies, the board members, the man who had mocked him. Every pair of eyes was on him. "You wanted silence, Charles," Daniel said, his voice low but carrying. "Now you have it. The kind that falls when truth is too loud to deny." He pushed through the doors and stepped into the sunlight, leaving the echo of his words behind. Victory strategy progress had reached its breaking point. The crisis had proven competence, whispers had leaked his past, exposure had cracked Charles's mask, and now public confrontation had sealed the reversal. What came next would no longer be whispers or rumors. It would be decisions. The board, the employees, the community, they had witnessed too much to go back. And Charles Remington? He stood in the ruins of his authority, cufflinks gleaming like relics of a world that had already shifted beneath his feet. The sunlight hit Daniel's face as he stepped out of the atrium, the glass doors closing behind him. For a moment, the city noise drowned the echoes of applause still rolling through the building. He exhaled, steady, as if releasing years of weight he had carried alone. The sketchbook pressed against his chest reminded him why he had stood so firm. Not for power, not for recognition, but for Elena. Always for her. On the upper floors, the boardroom buzzed with urgency. Charles Remington's empire had cracked in front of witnesses, and whispers were no longer whispers. They were loud enough to rattle the foundation. By evening, calls were already being made, meetings rescheduled, reputations reconsidered. The story of a janitor saving the CEO's son had become more than gossip. It was an indictment. Daniel walked the streets home, Elena's hand tucked into his. She swung her arm gently, smiling, as if she carried none of the burden he felt. "Dad, did you see them clapping?" she asked. Her voice brimmed with pride. "I saw," he said quietly. "They finally know," she said, squeezing his hand. "They know who you are." Daniel looked down at her, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "Maybe, but what matters is that you always did." When they reached their apartment, the building felt different. Neighbors who had barely glanced at him before now nodded respectfully. One older woman pressed her palms together, whispering, "Bless you for what you did." Daniel only gave a polite nod in return, his humility intact. Later that night, as Elena slept, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the sketchbook she had left open. Her drawings filled the pages, bridges, parks, and sunlit places where people stood together without fear or arrogance. Her vision was clear, a world where dignity wasn't hidden. The victory strategy was complete. Crisis had forced competence into the open. The board and employees had witnessed power collapse and dignity prevail. Charles Remington's wealth, authority, and arrogance had failed in the one place that mattered most, under the eyes of the people he ruled through fear. Silence had fallen, but it was no longer his. It belonged to Daniel, to Elena, to anyone who had ever been told they were less because of their title or uniform. In the days that followed, change rippled outward. The board launched a quiet review of leadership, their trust in Charles shaken. Employees no longer stepped aside to avoid Daniel in the halls. Instead, they greeted him with nods of respect. Whispers transformed into open recognition. Charles, meanwhile, retreated into his office. His cufflinks still gleamed, his suits still pressed, but his presence no longer commanded the same obedience. He had been exposed in public, his authority stripped in a single afternoon by a man he once dismissed as nothing. Daniel never sought to exploit it. He returned to his duties, mopping floors, repairing leaks, emptying bins, but the work no longer carried the same shadow of invisibility. He walked with quiet dignity, his past still unspoken, yet no longer denied. One evening, Elena crawled into his lap as he sat by the window. "Dad," she whispered, "what happens now?" Daniel wrapped his arm around her, looking out at the city glowing beneath the night sky. "Now we keep living," he said softly. "We keep walking tall, and we let the truth do the rest." The camera of the story pulls back here, leaving Daniel and Elena silhouetted against the light, father and daughter, humble yet unshaken, dignity intact. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with fanfare. It comes with silence, the kind that falls only after the truth has been spoken, in front of everyone who once refused to hear it. And if you followed this story until the end, you know why it matters. Ordinary fathers, ordinary daughters, lives dismissed by arrogance, until a single moment of truth changes everything. Now it's your turn. Tell me, what story should we tell next? What injustice should we strip bare? What underdog should stand tall against the weight of power? Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Title: Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?